St. Louis, home to the Cardinals, Emo's Pizza, and most recognizably, the Arch. While many view this smaller, mid-American city as their home or simply a stop along their road trip, just across the Mississippi lies one of the most tenacious places in the United States, East St. Louis. Despite its name, East St. Louis is not part of the city proper and in fact isn't even in the state of Missouri. Once named an all-American city with a booming hub for the rail industry, what's left of it now has a homicide rate over 28 times the national average, and has landed a spot on the FBI's top 100 most dangerous list. That being said, the streets at night aren't exactly the safest place to be. Yet when you have kids or a drug habit to feed, there is little you wouldn't do to have those needs met. And that's exactly what 34-year-old Alicia Greenwade was doing in the early morning hours of April 1st, 2001. That night, she was working the stroll as a sex worker, like she had done many times before. In addition to her work, I'd love to tell you more about the kind of person she was and what hobbies brought joy to her life. But unfortunately, there isn't a whole lot of background information about her or really any of the victims that we'll discuss in this case. I don't think that's a coincidence, but you'll see why later. But for now, let's continue. As a car pulls up to the curb, Alicia approaches the car and begins chatting a little bit with the customer, trying to get a read for the situation. Was he acting nervous or threatening? Were there other people in the car? What exactly were his intentions with her? The ability to pick up on these things can be carefully developed over time, and sometimes pimps are in place to protect their girls. Still, there is no guaranteed safety in this line of work, and yet millions step into the streets every day, placing their lives at risk. This particular night, Alicia trusted the client that had approached her, not knowing what the rest of the night had in store. The following morning, Alicia Greenwade's body was found unclothed in a ditch on the side of 60th Street in nearby Washington Park, about 4 miles west. Her wrists and ankles, though not bound, showed signs of restraint, and her neck had marks consistent with strangulation. Initially, police had a difficult time identifying her as she had nothing on her person, let alone an ID. One helpful clue left behind at the scene was a tire track left in the mud near her remains. Being that tire tread doesn't have exact identifiers, it hit a dead end. After forensic analysis had been completed, Illinois State Police were able to use fingerprints to identify her. Unfortunately, that was just about all that police discovered in their investigation. Without any other information to further dig into, the case grew cold. A month and a half later, on May 15th, 30 miles away in St. Charles County, Missouri, another woman's naked body was found just a few feet away from Highway 57, tangled in the weeds. While they were so close to a main road with passersby, it was a fairly rural area where the majority of traffic was by car and not on foot. Once again, the body was stripped, so no immediate ID could be made. Like in the Alicia Greenwade case, the next step would typically be to use forensic analysis to figure out who the victim is. In this case, though, the remains were so far into decomposition that fingerprints were unable to be analyzed and were basically non-existent. In a stroke of luck, the medical examiner discovered that the victim was wearing dentures labeled Wilson 1890, which, with the click of a few buttons, led to the identification of Teresa Wilson. Another month passes and the police are called back to the scene of Teresa Wilson's discovery. Not to further investigate her case, but because another body had been found only 16 feet away. Facing yet another unknown victim, the police were able to determine a pattern in what was beginning to look like a serial killer who had a thing for prostitutes. Semen was found and collected from all 3 victims, which were then matched against the DNA of millions of felons across the national database. Unfortunately, there were no results, and 8 months after the murders began, they ended abruptly. Investigators chalked up the sudden halt to the fact that 9/11 had just occurred the previous month, and maybe the perpetrator had been a service member that was deployed. Or maybe he'd gotten caught committing another crime and was locked up elsewhere. Nonetheless, there were no concrete answers. Skipping ahead again to May 2002, Bill Smith, a journalist for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, publishes the story of Teresa Wilson in an attempt to spread the word, thereby possibly reaching reaching someone with a hint of information. Can we just take a moment to admire this man's hair, because he did the Bieber cut first. After publishing Teresa's story, Bill received an extremely alarming letter in the mail that read, "Dear Bill, nice sob story about Teresa Wilson. Write one about Greenwade. Write a good one, and I'll tell you where many others are to prove I'm real. Here's directions to number 17. Search in a 50-yard radius from the X. Put the story in the Sunday paper like the last." Along with the letter was a map titled Number 17, marked in an area much like the other victims were found, grassy and wooded near a highway in West Alton. Upon looking into the return address of the letter, Bill found that it matched a bondage website called Thraldom. Obviously, getting a letter from the perpetrator of serial murders is both terrifying and helpful, but Bill thought it was all too crazy to be true, and it was probably just somebody playing some sort of sick joke. He didn't want any part of it, and didn't involve himself in the plan that the author had concocted. He instead turned over the letter to the police, who then went straight to work analyzing the evidence. Forensic technicians attempted to collect both DNA and fingerprints from the note without success. When inspecting the map, they noticed it had been printed from the internet rather than purchased in print. If you're a younger viewer, yes, printing the online MapQuest directions used to be the technologically advanced thing to do in the early 2000s. Oh, how far we've come. After sending the map to the cybercrimes unit, the investigators determined that the map matched the formatting from the travel site Expedia. At the police's request, Expedia turned over a log of all the IP addresses whose search criteria matched the coordinates provided around the time that the letter was sent to Bill Smith. After sifting through the IP addresses for a few days, they matched one UNet customer, 36-year-old Maury Troy Travis from Ferguson, Missouri. Maury was born October 25th, 1965 to his parents Sandra and Michael. However, he often went by the nickname Toby. He originally lived in St. Louis up until the age of 10 or 11 when his parents relocated to Ferguson. As a kid, he seemed very normal, if not mature for his age. It wasn't uncommon for adults to comment on how well-behaved and considerate he was, along with being a little bit shy. He kept to himself most of the time, so much so that many of his fellow classmates hadn't even heard of him before. Some of the neighbors weren't familiar with him either, but the ones who did knew him as the quiet kid who'd go out of his way to mow their lawns, for which they were very appreciative. For the most part, Maury's life was pretty standard, except for the fact that his parents eventually divorced. Still, he was far from being voted most likely to be a serial killer for senior superlative. Speaking of, he graduated from McClure Senior High School, followed by a 2-year stint in the Army Reserves. At the same time, he worked as a healthcare assistant and volunteered with the elderly at local nursing homes. In 1986, at age 22, he moved to Atlanta, Georgia, and enrolled in Morris Brown College. It was here that he met and fell madly in love with snow and skiing. And unfortunately, I'm not talking about the Winter Olympics. As addictions often do, it started small, just here and there on the weekends, then every weekend, and then the next thing he knew, Maury was spending about $300 a day on his habit, which in 2024 is more like over $850 worth. Being that it's difficult to maintain a job while in active addiction, Maury turned to crime in order to fund his habit. He went from never being in trouble with the law to committing 5 shoe store robberies in the span of 8 days over spring break. Most people don't go from a clean record straight into armed robbery, but Maury was apparently different in this way. Despite seemingly going from 0 to 100, Maury wasn't a completely hardened criminal. He didn't use a real gun during the robberies, instead using a plastic one for show. Not that it really makes the situation any better because the victims were threatened as if the guns were real, but this is still worlds away from being a serial killer. He was caught after witnesses reported details of his vehicle, which made it easy for police to arrest him. Authorities noted that even while detained, Maury remained reserved and respectful. When questioned, he admitted to being in a drug-fueled state during that stretch of time, which could have explained why this seemingly happened out of nowhere. Instead of landing straight in jail, Maury was sent to a drug rehabilitation program, which he completed successfully. During sentencing, several people appeared in court to give character witness statements in support of Maury, emphasizing that this was a one-off occurrence. Even Congressman William Clay wrote a statement backing his character and asked the judge to grant leniency. Just as a side note, William Clay has since denied knowing Maury and claims that he basically just copy-pasted a lot of statements for people during his tenure. Despite all of the support, the court granted 23-year-old Maury 15 years in prison. Just a couple of months later, Maury wrote a judge begging and pleading for a reduced sentence, suggesting only 6 months as a sort of scared straight punishment. He detailed the dangerous nature of his new living environment, the poor conditions, and mentioned having ideations of ending his life every single day. But it made no difference, and 6 months later, Maury was still stuck behind bars. Realizing that it was going to be a long stay, he decided to make the best of it and behaved well enough to work in the kitchen and janitorial areas. Due to his good behavior, he was released on parole on June 14, 1994, only serving a third of his sentence. Upon release, Maury moved into his own place and tried to stay on the right track. The next-door neighbor said that he was perfect and that there wasn't a single complaint she had about him. She remembers a time when he accidentally scared her in the common laundry area and was extremely apologetic about it. From then on, he always made his presence known in advance to avoid the same situation. Eventually, her son became friendly with Maury, and they would often get together to drink beers in the front yard. Although things were starting to look up, they definitely weren't perfect. It wasn't long until Maury got involved in crack and heroin, which led to another prison stay for the remainder of the decade. When he was released again at the turn of the century, he once again tried to stay on the straight and narrow, finding a server job at the Mayfair Hotel. The neighbors this time around knew him as a quiet man who took great care of his Mitsubishi Eclipse in the driveway when he wasn't at work. Dang, nosy neighbors, stay in your lane. I say that as if I'm not deep diving into these cases and posting them on the internet. By the way, if you haven't already, please consider hitting the subscribe and like buttons down below if you're enjoying the video so far. But let's continue. Things started getting a little weird when Maury brought up to his coworkers and neighbors that his friend's car was set on fire in East St. Louis, and he added that it would be a good place to do so because there isn't a large police presence there. And they got even weirder when Maury asked his friend, an intern at Channel 30 News, if they were going to do a report on the missing prostitutes in the area. He also mentioned having a friend who knew some information on the killer. The intern did bring up the story to her boss, but was brushed off. So with all this background information on Maury Travis, let's jump back to 2002, when the police have discovered that he is the one who searched and printed the Expedia map and is therefore likely the author of the note and the perpetrator. On June 7th, the Ferguson police paid Maury a visit at his home. They initially tried to pet his cat, but Maury really didn't like that and snatched the cat out of their reach. He went on to suggest that he knew why they were there, but he still acted very deflective. For about 2 hours, he was extremely vague and kept asking the investigators how they found out that it was him. It appears that Maury overlooked just how easy the internet could and can be traced, and he believed that he was truly anonymous. He actually cursed his computer, and police decided that he was looking very suspicious at this point, so they detain him on 2 counts of federal kidnapping and escort him out of the house, where he is eventually taken to the Metro Police Station for interrogation. At the same time, a forensic team went in looking for any traces of evidence. Although the basement was finished, its single bedroom containing only a bed and a computer seemed pretty unremarkable. It wasn't until the investigators took a closer look and saw blood splatter on the walls that it prompted them to pull up the carpet, where they found several bloodstains underneath, leading to the realization that this was Maury's torture dungeon. They found a leather belt smeared smeared with blood, along with a collection of videotapes depicting Maury assaulting women in various ways, both mentally and physically, before taking their lives. The disturbing ways in which he treated these women was a stark contrast to the way he'd been described throughout his life by those who knew him, or at least thought they knew him. Footage containing at least 2 victims were a part of the collection, and in the beginning of the clips, Maury had asked the women to state their names. Ultimately, it did not help in finding out who these women were, because they used working aliases in place of their government names. However, they were able to identify one of the victims as Betty James. At the start of his interrogation, police were quick to offer Maury a snack or beverage, firstly to build rapport and make him feel more comfortable to speak openly, but most importantly, to gather DNA evidence. Maury took the bait hook, line, and sinker as he drank from a can of Coca-Cola, which would eventually go on to match the samples taken from Yvonne Cruz and Brenda Beasley. This brought up the potential for a death sentence. As he spoke, it was noted that Maury clearly saw his victims as less than human by the way that he treated and spoke about them.
Stop for you gonna keep my house, please. So if you now you sit your ass down like I said. You sorry? Yes. You sorry about what? Everything. Jumping in the car with a motherfucker you don't know? Huh? Yes. You sorry? Yes. You wanna say something to your kids? Mama, sorry. Raising your kids? Me and my mom and dad. You ain't raising shit. You on here in your back smoking crack.
He had clearly got a kick out of degrading these women and shaming them for their work, even though he was on the receiving end of their service. Typical. He eventually insists that he was born this way and had been so for as long as he could remember, despite others' accounts. The only person he ever truly cared about was his mother. As detectives continued the interrogation for over 8 hours, Maury showed remorse not once. He then asked for an attorney and insisted that he would not be going back to prison. He had blatant disdain for the people whose lives he needlessly took. It seems as if he chose his victims due to them being so accessible, more easily taken advantage of due to substance use and emotional state, and since they were strangers, the lack of connection would make it easier for him to get away. Despite being on suicide watch inside the St. Louis County Jail, Maury Troy Travis hung himself on June 17th in his cell after 3 days in custody. Officials have since admitted that they didn't take as many precautions as they should have. Obviously. Guards had missed 2 consecutive safety checks, leaving Maury with 30 minutes unsupervised. With Maury gone, police lost a lot of information that only he as the killer knew about his crimes and his victims. They believe he may have killed 10, 12, or even up to 20 sex workers across St. Louis County, including 61-year-old Mary Shields, 19-year-old Cassandra Walker, and 36-year-old Verona Thompson. At least 4 of his victims remain Jane Does, their families left to wonder what happened to their loved one. Over the years, this case has been featured in episodes of both Forensic Files and Cold Case Files. It was actually while watching one of these episodes that a woman named Katrina McGraw recognized the house that she was currently sitting in at that moment where Maury Travis killed his victims. It wasn't long before she discovered that her landlord was actually Maury's mother, and when Katrina tried to break her lease and get her money back, the mother refused. After being approached by the local HOA, the landlord finally agreed to let Katrina break free of living in this former crime scene. This is a little off topic, but how do you guys feel about living in a house where you know somebody has passed away? I would personally feel a little uncomfortable living in a place where I knew something so violent and horrible had happened, but surely a lot of us, if not all of us, have lived in a place where somebody has, whether it be from natural or unnatural causes. A little morbid to think about, but Food for thought. That just about brings us to the end of today's video, and I want to thank you so much for sitting down to talk some true crime with me. I felt a real sense of sadness and anger in researching this case because the victims were never really given any justice. Even if Maury had stuck around to serve his sentence, there's still so little information out there about the victims that a lot of them haven't even been identified. Not only did Maury straight up admit that East St. Louis was a good place to commit crimes because of the lack of police presence, but let's keep in mind that these victims were number 1, black, number 2, women, and number 3, sex workers. So police really aren't looking out for them in the first place. I hate to see it and I hate to say it, but it's true. I mean, not only that, but Maury himself and the whole serial killer on the loose thing never really caught on because of where it was happening and the demographic that it was happening to. I spent my high school years like 20 minutes from East St. Louis and never heard about this case until recently. It really makes you wonder what other scary things are going on under the radar. Anywho, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will be sure to see you in the next one. Alright guys, bye!